This video is about winter books, so I'm wearing a scarf. Just a quick reminder, if you love what I do and you want to support this channel, you can do so at Patreon over on patreon.com/booksandbow. If you join for just $1, then you get access to a Discord server full of like-minded bookworms where we all talk about books every day, and it is just lovely. If you've got $10 to spare, then you get to join a private Zoom book club that I host once a month. I love my Patreon, I love my community, and I'm so grateful for their support, and I would love yours as well. In this video, I'm going to talk about winter books. Now, defining a winter read, just like any other season, can be kind of tricky. A book that feels like winter, a book that's ideal to read during the winter time, a book that is thematically about Christmas or the cold. It might be something to do with isolation and horror and terror. Horror books are great to read in the winter season. Murder mysteries are also amazing reads for the winter. So many people love to read Agatha Christie books over the winter. So let's dig into anything that feels appropriate for the winter season. And there's quite a variety here for you to dig into. Cozy reads, murder mysteries, horror books. I'm trying to cover as much as possible. Let's go. I'm going to get the most obvious one out of the way. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This is a book that a lot of people read in the run-up to Christmas, sometimes on Christmas Eve, and that's when I often read it. Not every year, maybe every other year I decide to read A Christmas Carol and watch A Muppet Christmas Carol, obviously. A Christmas Carol is a short story. Well, is it a short story? It's a short story. It's not long. It's a novella. It doesn't take long to read. You can read it in a day. If you've never read it before, what's really nice about it is it's got Dickens's playful language, his wonderful character names and dialogue, but it's also a Christmas novel that's not really about Christianity. Even though Dickens himself was a Christian, it doesn't bog you down with biblical messages. It just establishes that the true meaning of Christmas is kindness to each other. Supporting your neighbours, looking out for your family, your friends, your community at large. And I don't really need to tell you what happens in the story, everyone knows A Christmas Carol. But if you've only ever watched film and TV adaptations, read A Christmas Carol. It's absolutely charming. The playful language, the way that it tugs at your heartstrings just right, the happy ending, it's a perfect story. Dickens' writing is gorgeous, it's always gorgeous, and it really suits Christmas. He has a lot of winter-related stories, and this is his biggest and best one. I mentioned in the introduction Agatha Christie. You can read any Agatha Christie book for winter, really, except maybe Death on the Nile, because hot. But anything that's set in a big mansion, a small village, Murder on the Orient Express, these are obvious choices. There is something almost indescribably cozy about her murder mystery stories, about all murder mystery stories. But there is a collection called Midwinter Murders, a collection of short Agatha Christie stories that are set during the winter period. And that's really the best one that you can read around the winter time. But any will do. If you've never read Agatha Christie before, I mean, there's nothing like her. I myself have read 7 or 8 of her books at this point. Not enough. I've got more to go through, obviously. But she is something very, very special. And curling up by the fireside, reading a murder mystery, there is no feeling like it. So, read an Agatha Christie book this winter. And Midwinter Murders is obviously the smartest choice thematically, tonally, setting-wise, but any will do. Since Christmas is a time for children, an obvious example for kids, for you if you're a parent, and for you if you're an adult who still loves Christmas as much as I do, Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Little Women is a children's novel, but it's something that anyone can enjoy at any age. I first read it in my 20s, and I loved it. I would have loved it more as a child, but I didn't read it as a child. And Little Women is great because it is predominantly set during the winter, as far as I remember. There's a lot of winter in it. There's Christmas in it, and it also celebrates childhood imagination. The bonds between kids, the bonds between sisters, the bonds between kids and their parents. It's very much a novel about childhood, about growth, about family and closeness. And given how much winter is in it, it's a perfect winter read. Again, it's quite an obvious choice. A lot of people read Little Women during Christmas, and a lot of people watch the Little Women films at Christmas. I did, last Christmas. I watched the 1994 film? 90-something. It was really good. Really, really good. Anywho, this was my favourite novel for a long, long time. I got into reading quite late in life. I've talked about this before. I was in my late teens when I started reading, and I've really done my best to make up for that. But as a teenager, my favourite book was Northern Lights by Philip Pullman. In the US, I think it's called The Golden Compass. At least that's what the film was called. Northern Lights is again a great choice because it's a children's book and children love the winter time, children love snow, children love Christmas. And it's a great time to get in touch with your inner child. My inner child loves Northern Lights, so I'm probably going to reread it around Christmas time. Northern Lights is a wonderful adventure story. It's also set pretty strongly in the Arctic. It begins in an alternate Oxford, an Oxford that is slightly different to our own, and our protagonist ends up going on a big journey to the north, to the Arctic Circle, which is populated by witches and polar bears that wear armor and talk and live in these clans. Northern Lights is a beautiful, beautiful story about adventure, magic, and it has very strong anti-religious themes that are incredibly famous at this point. Which is another reason I loved it as a teenager, because I was one of those angry atheist kids. But the winter setting, the childhood wonder of it all, the adventure, it's a perfect story for winter. Any chance I get to recommend a Terry Pratchett book, I'm excited, and the obvious choice here is Hogfather. In the Discworld that Terry Pratchett created and honed and expanded over his lifetime, you have the Hogfather, which is the Discworld's answer to Father Christmas or Santa Claus. And something happens which means he's not around for a while, and so Death, one of the four main protagonists of the Discworld, kind of tries to replace him during his busy period. It's a Terry Pratchett novel. Again, like Agatha Christie, his books are great to read around this time because Christmas is a time of joy and happiness, and his books are very joyous and happy. But they're also really good to read in the January-February period, where, especially if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, the world is very, very dark and dismal. After the big lights and colour of Christmas, winter gets pretty dark and sad. January is the saddest month. So fill up your January with Terry Pratchett books. Read Hogfather for Christmas, and then after that, read whatever your favourites are. And if you've never read him before, start at the beginning with The Colour of Magic, or just pick one up at random, because that's how they work. Except for The Light Fantastic, because that's the only one that's a direct sequel. Again, I haven't read every Terry Pratchett book, but I've read a lot, and the Discworld is something very, very special. So read Hogfather for Christmas, and if it cheers you up, if it makes you feel happy, if you love his sense of humour, which of course you will, then read as many more as you can fit in during the colder, sadder months of January and February. As for horror, a great choice is The Shining by Stephen King. The Shining is set during the winter. You've got a man who's a struggling alcoholic who takes his family to this hotel that is empty over the winter season, and he has been taken on as the caretaker. He and his family live in this empty hotel over the winter period. Creepy, scary things start to happen. His mind unravels, and you've got this wonderful sense of isolation, this mountaintop hotel, closed off by the snowfall. It's horror. It's a winter theme, but it also captures the darker side of winter. The cold, the dread, the isolation, the darkness, the way that all of these things seep into your bones, into your brain. Winter can be a very dark period, and if you want to lean into that, then you should read The Shining. And obviously watch the film as well. Agatha Christie is not the only great murder mystery writer. Japan's answer to Agatha Christie was Seishi Yokomizo, and we now have an increasing number of his books being brought to us by various translators. I think at the time of recording there are 4 books of his out, and the very first one, the Hanjin Murders, is perfect for winter. Just look at the cover. It is a blood-soaked katana half buried in the snow. The Hanjin Murders takes place out in the Japanese wilderness about 100 years ago. A family is doing a marriage ceremony and a murder happens. This is his first murder mystery story. It introduces Detective Kindaichi, who is his answer to Poirot, and it's set in a snowy landscape. A cabin in the woods surrounded by 2 feet of snow, and it is a locked room murder mystery. What's kind of fun about this one is that it's kind of got a framing device that's like a play, where a person stands on stage and explains that this really happened. And they kind of tell us and narrate this story to us. It creates this sense of camp theatricality, which is very important to murder mystery stories, to really sell the atmosphere and the pomp and the almost glamour of them. They are campy, they are fun, they are exaggerated things. Kindaichi and Poirot are pretty unlikable, pompous people that are really fun to watch. The Hanjin Murders is a lot of fun. And if you want to read a murder mystery that isn't by Agatha Christie, you need to read Seishi Okamizo and start with the Hanjin Murders. This is also a great excuse for me to talk about my favourite novel, Frankenstein. Frankenstein begins in the Arctic Circle, with an adventurer who's writing letters to his sister. He's trying to find... Is it the Northwest Passage? I think that's it. Can't remember. I guess that means it's time for me to reread Frankenstein for the 12th time. But with this framing device, you know that Frankenstein begins and ends in this place. A ship stranded in the thick, dense ice. A madman who gets pulled up onto the ship and tells us his story. That he is currently being chased across the ice by a monster that he created. And then we flip back to Frankenstein's childhood, his university years, and him creating his creature. The gothic setting, the science fiction, the fact that it's incredibly campy, a wild gothic adventure, a sad tale of abandonment, gorgeous landscapes being described, and this icy, remote, isolated setting is perfect. It's a perfect winter read, especially after Christmas. Read Frankenstein in January. That's the time to read a dark gothic novel that is at least partially set in the icy wilderness. In terms of an ideal setting, another great Japanese novel is The Forest of Wool and Steel by Natsu Miyashita. This is a book that not enough people talk about when we discuss the Japanese canon. It's a really, really cozy novel translated by Philip Gabriel into English. And it's set in Hokkaido. Hokkaido is the big open landscape island at the top of Japan. It is covered in 3 feet of snow in the depths of winter. And aside from the capital, Sapporo, which is described as the Tokyo of the North because it's got lots of neon and big open avenues and hosts an ice sculpture festival every year, I think that takes place in February. Beyond Sapporo, which is in the south of the island, you have this big open landscape of small towns, mountains, forests, lakes. It's a huge open landscape, and the Forest of Wool and Steel takes place in a small town in Hokkaido. A boy who is a piano tuner. Quite often, when you have books about music, the protagonist is a musician. Not here. He's a piano tuner. He's an apprentice. And this is the story of him bonding with the other people around him, the people that he works for, the people whose jobs he takes on. It's a really charming kind of coming-of-age tale set in the cold wilderness of Hokkaido. A great winter read. I actually read this in the height of summer, and I really wish I'd read it in winter instead. Another great children's book that's a really popular read around the winter time, especially around Christmas, is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. The Hobbit is a wonderful adventure for children, and it's really, really popular as a Christmas read. I actually once received a copy for Christmas and read the whole thing on Christmas Day. There's something Christmassy about it. It was one of the first fantasy adventure stories about a little halfling who is recruited by a big tall wizard man and a group of dwarfs to go on a big adventure to steal gold from a dragon who lives in a big mountain. I mean, you don't need me to tell you what The Hobbit is about, but it's a great read for winter. If you've been wondering, what should I read around Christmas time? Read The Hobbit. Again. Another great horror novel for the winter time is The Shape of Darkness by Laura Purcell, one of my favourite horror authors. Her 4th novel, The Shape of Darkness, is set in the Victorian period, in Bath, one of the most beautiful cities in the world in my opinion, and it's set in the winter, while Bath is coated in snow. This is a horror novel, but it's also kind of a thriller, kind of a murder mystery. It's a novel with layers, a novel with multiple protagonists, a few different perspectives, a mystery, and then another mystery, death, subterfuge, a lot of paranoia. And all of these things thematically are really great to enjoy around the winter period, because winter makes us feel those things. Winter hides mystery. Winter makes us feel cold and alone and paranoid. And if you want to lean into those feelings, read The Shape of Darkness. And the autumn and winter periods are perfect for gothic novels. When I did a video and an article about autumn books, I recommended Wuthering Heights. And for winter, I'm going to recommend Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is a very obvious choice for the winter. It is a gothic romance, very unlikable broken people falling in love against maybe what is in everyone's best interests. It's got isolation, the love is fierce and dark, there are secrets, you've got the mad woman in the attic, a very, very famous aspect of this novel. If you've never read Jane Eyre, it's quite beefy, it takes you a few days to read, and that's ideal as a winter read. Again, read it after Christmas, read this in January or February. A gothic romance, a classic of both gothic and romantic genres. Even though I did briefly mention The Hogfather, I'd like to include a fantasy novel on this, a very serious fantasy novel, and that would be The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. This is a fantasy novel inspired by Viking mythology and a Northern European setting, set in a world where gods a few hundred years ago had a big war and they all died, and now humans live amongst their bones. Very, very cool setting. Our protagonists are hunters, mercenaries, Vikings, and their journeys slowly meet as the story goes on. The Shadow of the Gods is a fantastic, epic, Viking-inspired fantasy tale, but it's set in the snow, it's set in the wilderness, it's set in a perfectly wintry place. So I hugely recommend this if you want to read a fantasy novel around Christmas. Read The Shadow of the Gods. The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern is another great read for winter. It's a great read for any time of year. Pick up The Night Circus, it's a fantastic read. But in the winter, it's great to read a book that's predominantly set at night. A book that is full of magic and mystery. A book that is set in the Victorian period. A book that's full of beautiful lyrical language. You look back and think about the fact that this was a debut novel. It's incredible. It's a wonderfully magical, I guess, urban fantasy novel. It feels Shakespearean, it feels poetic. The magic and mystery of it, it really feels wintry. At a time where everything feels darker and yet magic things happen. There is so much magic in the history and the lore of Christmas and wintertime, and that makes The Night Circus an ideal read for this time of year. And finally, I want to recommend The Gospel of Loki by Joanne Harris. I love this book. I love The Gospel of Loki so much. I was kind of annoyed when it first came out because I read it, I fell in love with it, and then Neil Gaiman wrote his Norse mythology book, which kind of overshadowed The Gospel of Loki hugely. And The Gospel of Loki is just Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology, but smarter, because it takes all of these individual Norse myths and threads them together into a single narrative, a single novel about Loki. It is his tale. It takes all the famous stories of Loki and what he got up to, the things he did, the things he saw, the things he caused, and creates a single narrative, a single novel. It's full of wit, it's full of adventure and action, it's full of absolutely ridiculous events because the Norse gods were wild and strange and trippy things, and it's all a single novel, a single narrative. And because it's about Norse gods, it's cold, it's wintry, it's mountainous, but it's also a really, really fun adventure story. Somewhere between a YA fantasy and an adult fantasy. It's tongue-in-cheek, it's goofy, it's sweet. It's a lot of fun. Please check out The Gospel of Loki. More people need to read it. It's endless fun. Okay, there are your winter reads. That is a selection of, I think, 15 books that all take place in winter or feel like winter reads, feel ideal for the winter period. Murder mysteries, horror novels, cozy books. Enjoy. Go read some really, really good stuff this winter and cheer yourself up. Keep yourself warm, keep yourself cozy. And once again, if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoy all my videos, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I really, really appreciate the help. Without my patrons, I wouldn't put out as many videos as I do. Thank you for your support, and subscribe for books.